everyone. My name is Hongwei Wu. I am very glad to present our paper, VeriBin, Adaptive Verification of Patches at the Binary Level. This work represents joint effort between Purdue University and Simon Fraser University. Well, when it comes to vulnerability maintenance, the saying, "If it unbroke, don't fix it," often rings true. The fear of introducing new issues can lead vendors to leave the vulnerability unpatched, especially in domains where the reliability is the primary concern, for example, in automotive or medical devices. While tools like SIMDiff, Spider, and RDiff have made significant progress in semantic equivalence and patch verifications, they rely on having the source code or even the build chain. Unfortunately, these source codes and build chains aren't always accessible. That's why we need some verification tools that can work at the binary level. Imagine that you receive a patched binary from a third-party vendor. How can you formally verify that this patched binary doesn't break the existing functionality or even introduce unwanted changes? It would be super helpful if we have such verification tools that can formally model the patch effects without source code and ensures that the patch preserves the original functionality. Traditionally, to verify some binary level patches, the analysts need to manually track the byte patterns or even do some structural comparison with bindiff, or use manual work to compare the decompiled code. While these methods can find the potential changes, they often require extensive human effort and are prone to errors. That's why we propose VeriBin. It is the first system to describe and verify the patch behaviors at the binary level for functionality preserving properties. And our tool is adaptive, meaning that we can enhance the analyst with the domain-specific insights from the analyst. Here is an overview design of VeriBin. We start from the original and patched binary, and then the preprocessor step will extract some static information from the binary, including the matching functions, matching base blocks, and function signatures. Then we enter our first phase, patch-aware symbolic execution, which I will explain in details in my following slides. Let's start with some challenges we faced when using SMT solvers to compare functions. We found that the compiler-introduced offset changes often hinder the verification. Also, the complicated symbolic expressions due to some information loss are hard to compare. To address this, we propose two solutions. We first detect and ignore those compiler-introduced offset changes using some combination methods. We then simplify the symbolic comparisons in a path-by-path way using matching path pairs. Let me first explain to you what is compiler-introduced offset change. It is a variation in memory addresses between the original and patched binary, referring to identical memory content. These changes often caused by compiler optimizations, and they don't reflect the actual patch modifications. That's why we would like to ignore them. In this given example, the memory address of variable A shifts from RBP-1 to RBP-5, leading to a potential function call argument inequivalence when this argument is passed to function checkval. We would like to ignore this because it doesn't represent the actual patch behavior. VeriBin used 3 heuristic-based techniques to detect those compiler-introduced offset changes. The first method is comparing the contents at fixed addresses for global read-only variables. In this example, we directly compare the content at these 2 memory addresses, and it turns out that they both contain the same content ABC. We then check whether all the local variables are shifted by the same constant offset. In this example, we notice all the function arguments are shifted by the same offset hex 20. That's why we can ignore these differences. Finally, we match expressions in similar abstract syntax tree positions, differing only by an offset. After talking about compiler-introduced offset change, let's move on to our second challenge. We solved the complicated symbolic comparison with matching path pair. But what is matching path pair? We define it as a pair of valid exit path, O and P, where any input I executing P in the patched function also executes O in the original function. In other words, the path constraint of P implies that of O. In these cases, we can directly compare the symbolic values between these matched pairs instead of comparing the merged values across all the paths. This optimization is super useful for security patches because they are relatively small in scope. Here is an example. In this switch case, the content of a global variable is determined by the switch case, and the patch is modifying one value. If we merge all the paths, then the SMT solver would need to compare a very complicated symbolic expressions. However, if we use matching path pair, we can directly compare two integer values between the matching path, and it will be very easy. After our first phase, we extracted the symbolic expressions of the patch behaviors. We then moved to our second phase, adaptive verification, where we verify some safe to apply properties and involves analysts to validate those violations. Before delving into the details, let me explain to you some key terminologies. The first one is valid exit path to a function. We categorize all reachable complete execution path into two categories. Valid exit path referring to complete path that takes valid inputs, while error handling exit path referring to those invalid inputs. And our verification only focuses on valid exit path. To ensure that the patch is not breaking the original functionality, VeriBin will check 4 properties from 2 perspectives: not increasing input space and output equivalence. These properties have been proposed by a previous research called Spider, showing here. And these properties are relevant to security patches because they usually just add checks and terminate the execution. VeriBin then automates the verification of safe to apply properties. If all the properties are true, the patch is deemed safe to apply. However, if any property fails, we will identify the root cause of the failure and involves analysts to validate the root cause, then use their feedback to refine the analysis process to filter out some semantically equivalent changes. Here is an example of adaptive verification. Consider a patch replacing an insecure encryption function 3DES with a safer version, AES. By definition, this patch is not safe to apply. And VeriBin can detect this potential violation and ask the analyst, can we consider these two functions equivalent? If the analyst confirms yes, then we can integrate this information and refine our verification. Then we might potentially determine this patch as safe to apply. We conducted evaluation on 86 pairs of original and patched binaries from 3 datasets. And our evaluation covers both unstripped and stripped versions with no false positives, meaning that unsafe patches will never be incorrectly categorized as safe. And the average runtime for our tool is around 1,300 seconds. We also conducted other experiments about adaptive verification and ablation studies. If you're interested, we highly recommend checking our paper for more details. And I will present 2 case studies. The first one is about a safe to apply patch in tidy. As we can see, this minimal patch only adds a check and terminates. By definition, it is safe to apply because the patch only restricts the input space and there are no functionality breaking modifications introduced. VeriBin will verify this patch with all 4 safe to apply properties verified as true, and finally concludes that this patch is safe to apply. We also apply VeriBin on the recently discovered XZ backdoor, which was maliciously introduced to the XZ Utils project via an obfuscated building script in compilation. And VeriBin can easily detect this backdoor that an assembly instruction CPU ID is replaced by a function called getCPUID, and finally determines that this patch is not safe to apply. This case study highlights the need for binary level verification, even when the source code is available. In summary, we propose VeriBin. We compare a binary with its patched version to determine whether the patch is safe to apply. And our tool is very accurate with no false positives. We also open source our tool in order to help further research in this area. That's all about my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Any question?
Thank you for great presentation. I have a question regarding your solution to compiler introduced offset shift. So I think that is because after you convert that to binary, you have the symbols lost. So why don't you just analyze the assembly instead of analyzing the binary? I think the assembly has almost the same information, but more like the symbol related stuff. So if you're using assembly for the analysis, you have the symbols to this global variable. So you do not need to compare the content. You just refer to the symbol, and it's simpler, right?
I think we are actually doing symbol executions on top of assembly code. Actually, those binary level codes will be converted to some high level IR, like vex IR,
yes,
something like that. And they will not have all the reference to global variables. For example, some stack variables will still be shifted, right? That's why we still need to handle.
So you mean during compiling this, this information is still lost?
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Time is flying, so.
Yeah, we can discuss offline.
Maybe offline. Thanks the speaker again.
Thank you.